Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from wherever you join. Thank you for joining us today online. It's my great pleasure to welcome you and all on behalf of the Natural Resource Governance Institute, NRGI, and the ETH Center for Development and Cooperation, NADEL. My name is Fritz Brucker. I am the co-director of NADEL. And the topic of today's event is the renewed relevance of resource governance in the age of the energy transition. We have selected this topic for two reasons. First, the energy transition is the most fundamental challenge that we have to master as a global society. Without that, a sustainable future will not be possible at all. However, Glasgow has demonstrated that action to put this energy transition into reality still lags behind the urgency of the topic and also the rhetoric acknowledgement of the challenge. So it's important to focus on this major challenge that we have as a global community. The second reason to focus on this topic is that the energy transition focuses so much on getting out of oil, gas, and coal, and is so much excited about solar power, wind turbines, and batteries, that there is a risk that the material base that powers this transition gets into the background. Although without mining, and there will be a lot of additional demand for resources for this transition, without mining, it will not be possible to meet this challenge. At the same time, those countries that depend today on oil, gas, and coal extraction will face a completely different set of challenges to transition to new economic models and find new ways to finance development. This is why we talk about the renewed relevance of resource governance in the age of energy transition. NRGI and NADEL organized this webinar together. So did we organize the course on resource governance that ends with today's webinar. And we do it the second time together, this course. But today's webinar also marks the beginning of an intensified cooperation between the two institutions. NRGI and NADEL entered into a longer-term partnership this year. The goal to work together as researchers and practitioners on resource governance challenges is motivated by the conviction that we can achieve better results when different institutions join. The cooperation between ETH NADEL as an academic institution with NRGI as a policy think tank is motivated by our conviction that the close cooperation and exchange between research and academia on one hand and policy and practice on the other hand are important. We can not get better practice without better research and better theories, but research and theories need also input and close connection with practice and policy. This requires researchers to work with practitioners and policymakers and systematically learn from experience and vice versa. This is why we are very excited about this cooperation that we entered together for the next 4 years and look forward to explore the topic of energy transition, its implication on resource governance for all different resource-dependent countries together. With that, I wish you an inspiring and thought-provoking next hour in this webinar, and I hand over to Margarita Batzel from the Natural Resource Governance Institute. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Fritz. Thanks to our colleagues at NADEL, and thanks to the panelists and moderator for participating. And of course, to all of you for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed this discussion that we're about to begin. As Fritz Brugger mentioned, this is the closing event of our annual advanced course on natural resource governance and development, policies and practice. This is the second edition of this course, and due to the pandemic restrictions, both iterations have taken place online. It has been a challenge, but we learned so much along the way and are happy to have taken the risk and continued offering this capacity building program to different stakeholders in the sector. Trainings, courses, and broader capacity development projects are at the core of our work at NRGI. As for probably most of you, over the last 2 years, we have to adapt our work in different ways, depending on the objective of the project, the context, and our audience. But despite this, NRGI has come a long way in designing and implementing interventions to continue influencing from a virtual environment. Migrating a successful in-person course to an online environment is a huge challenge, and we're constantly learning. Trial and error seems to be the only way to improve. As part of this adaptation, together with our partners at ETH Zurich, we redefined each module's learning objectives, keeping our audience's constraints in mind. We used a range of learning tools to maximize their experience, a mixture of live and recorded sessions, reading material, and existing videos from our different massive open online courses. We hosted Q&A sessions with experts, office hours with faculty, and coffee breaks to foster interaction among participants. During the course, we constantly encourage feedback from participants to adjust deadlines and learn for future editions of the course. The online version of this course is still a work in progress, and we're very much hoping to celebrate it in person next year. But as I said before, we're happy to have continued offering this training opportunity in a very critical moment for the extractive sector and for civic space in many of the countries where we work. This year, we received a group of 35 people coming from 20 different countries, from civil society, organizations, government, media, academia, and private sector. We're very happy now to welcome them to our great alumni network. We will stay in touch, continue sharing information and fostering discussions among peers to continue strengthening their knowledge and skills to successfully advance policy change in the extractive sector and beyond. Now we close this 2021 iteration of the course with a panel event on the renewed relevance of governance in the energy transition. Thanks for joining us, and I hope we all enjoy this stimulating discussion. Let's officially then begin this event, and I will give the floor to Leopold Peisler for the introduction to the topic. Leopold is a doctoral researcher at the Institute of Science, Technology and Policy at ETH Zurich. Now the floor is yours, Leopold, and welcome everyone. Thank you very much for joining us.
Great. Thank you, Margarita, so much for your kind introduction. I feel very honored today to give the introduction to this interesting and super exciting panel discussion. So for the next minutes, for the next 10 minutes, I would like to set the scope to this debate. And for this, I would like to cluster the 10 minutes into those 4 buckets with the catchy tags. And those will make sense as we go through these 10 minutes. So as a starting point, and as Fritz already mentioned, the COP26 in Glasgow in the last weeks has highlighted once again our national and international ambition to mitigate climate change as fast as possible and to reach a target well below 1.5 degrees, well below 2 degrees. So for this, we do have a remaining carbon budget. And the question is, how do we reach the temperature range without exceeding it and mitigating climate change? And to this end, we can look at this problem in different ways. You could cluster the carbon pockets according to the different sectors. So on the left-hand side, for example, we can see the energy sector, and the low carbon equivalent for this or transition would be quite straightforward, the low carbon or renewable electricity. Another major carbon contributor towards the industry is on the right-hand side, for example, petrochemical plants. So there you also have low carbon solutions, and quite important in this context is the transport sector, where we do see the electrification of combustion engines and other combustion processes. So there are some implications from this for mineral-rich countries. But before that, let's go back to the carbon budget. And this is a study by the University College of London, looking at how much fossil fuel can be extracted under a 1.5 degree scenario. And the left column is the goal until 2050, and on the right-hand side, you can see the status until 2100. And the different roles are the categories of fossil fuel. So you can see oil, gas, and coal. What's striking here is that in many instances across the globe, you can extract way less than what you could theoretically could if you were to disregard the carbon impact of, or the global warming impact of those fossil fuels. So thinking a step further, here you can see a figure from the Carbon Tracker organization. On the right-hand side, or sorry, on the x-axis, you see the share of oil and gas revenues from the total governmental revenues, and on the y-axis, you can see the potential shortfall over time in a sustainable development scenario from the IEA at a constant barrel price. And you could see that you have different tiers of countries who are exposed to the 1.5 degree scenario. For example, Nigeria here is a tier 4 player, and you have countries which are less exposed, but also more exposed. And we could see that not only with those fancy figures, but this has real world implications. I just pulled up the last 10 years of this oil and gas ETF and compared this to the representative clean energy index. So these dynamics have already picked up and have been for a long time on the financial market. There are actually obviously more extreme examples than those ETFs. Take Tesla, for example, or the not so strong recovery of oil and gas companies after the first COVID stock crash. And particular for mineral-rich countries, we do see a double exposure. So if you cannot extract as much fossil fuel as initially thought, you might end up, or if you don't plan strategically, you will end up with stranded assets. But on top of that, if you can see that material-rich countries, which happen to be as you can see in those regions here, largely, there's an increased risk exposure to climate change effects. This is from the special report on 1.5 degrees from the IPCC. So there are opportunities arising from this. If we learn that fossil fuels will decline and cannot be depleted to an extent which was initially thought possible, we do need substitute products. So, and for those products, we do need minerals. So this here is an estimate from the IEA on critical materials. In 2019, we can see that the revenue share of coal exceeds the revenues from critical materials by a factor of 10 almost. But this is set to change over time. So while the revenues from coal will decline sharply, we will see an even sharper increase of revenues from critical materials. And critical materials in this context are considered lithium, nickel, cobalt, graphite. So here in this study from the IEA, this is focused on electric vehicles or the underlying technology, lithium-ion batteries in particular, but there's even wider implications than for those limited selection of materials. And in 2040, we see that you would have significantly larger revenues from critical materials than you would have from coal. And this poses opportunities for mineral-rich countries. However, there's a set of challenges which also must be faced, and this an entire program here is about. So, for example, in order to serve the demand which arises from the transition, you do need to plan well ahead, because it can take up to 10 or 15 years, for example, once the decision to expand has been made, to actually produce at full capacity for the mines. And on top of this planning ahead, we also do see challenges in the realm of sustainability. So those would be social and environmental, but also the entire governance of the sector. And once again, this program here is the perfect platform for discussing this. So it is definitely key that a strategic and diligent action plan is developed by mineral-rich countries to mitigate the risk, but also to exploit the possibilities for the national, international economies, given this transition here. So, all in all, it's a very interesting and diverse discussion, which I'm looking forward to in this panel here. And from this 10 minutes, I would like you to take the following 3 points home. So there is a demand shift from fossil fuel to minerals. As a consequence, public investments in fossil fuel explorations or state-owned enterprises should be reconsidered. There's a considerable growth in mineral resources and a strategy needed in order to deal with them. And since mentioned earlier, it should happen as soon as possible. And lastly, to make use of this economic opportunities given in this context, a technology smart policy should be deployed. And if you're wondering what that is, I would like to forward you to our group homepage. This technology smart policy is one of our key terms, essentially. And now I am happy to hand over to Patrick Heller, the Chief Program Officer at NRGI from January 2020 onwards. And we're all looking forward to a great discussion. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Leopold, and thanks a lot to ETH NADEL and to all of the organizers of the course. I'm Patrick Heller, as Leopold said. Real pleasure to be here with all of you. A couple words about myself. One of the reasons that I'm with you today is that, along with my colleagues across NRGI and our partners all over the world, I've been spending quite a lot of time over the last couple of years helping think about how we do, I think the title of this panel is really relevant, how we do renew our approach to natural resource governance so as to support the countries where all of us are working in the global energy transition for the well-being of the planet and for the well-being of their citizens. And so I'm really excited to have the chance today to speak with this fantastic group of panelists to kind of wrestle with some of the challenges that Fritz and Margarita and Leopold have started to lay out for us. One other word about myself, I'm based in California in the US, so it's just after 6 o'clock a.m. here right now. I have my morning coffee with me, but if you see children wandering into the frame, that's my kids getting ready for school, so I apologize in advance. And one of the things that I like to do in these panels, I know that many of you who are participating in the webinar today, the Zoom functions don't always let you see who else is here. So just to give you a little bit of a sense, there's more than 60 people in the session today, and I can't see exactly where everyone is, but in terms of people who registered, we have folks from across Africa, Latin America, Europe, and Asia. So a really great group of participants, and we're really hoping that in the spirit of the course, you take advantage of the opportunity to use the Q&A function, make your voices heard, and really get us going in the discussion. So to kick us off into the panel, I think Leopold's presentation really queued things up incredibly effectively. And I love, Leopold, the language that you used about the double exposure that resource-rich countries, especially resource-rich low-income countries, are facing. We all know, as Leopold says, and your message really helped draw it home very clearly, that the climate crisis is real. It's not something that's off in the future. It is upon us right now as we speak. And it's many resource-rich countries that are feeling the most direct effects of climate change already, and that in some sense are least prepared, or at least face the biggest challenges in adapting their approach to management and governance to respond to the crisis. And so what we're going to focus on in the panel today, I think, really builds on what the course has been focusing on for the last couple of weeks, and that's how governance adapts to, and how our collective approach to governance adapts in response to the challenges and the opportunities that Leopold shared with us. We see that across our work, across the work that all of us are doing, that these conversations are really alive in ways that are impacting the plans, policies, strategies, challenges facing resource-rich, facing oil and mineral-rich countries. Even over the last couple of weeks at COP, for those of you who have been following the conference, we've seen lots of countries sign up to a new pledge on how to reduce the methane emissions associated with their oil and gas production. We've seen a heavy new focus on fossil fuel subsidies and what it means for countries that have always given the sector a little extra nudge in order to either help earn money or to help give citizens access to fuels that we know are no longer sustainable or viable. We're seeing donors who are making new pledges around shifting support away from the fossil fuel sector into the clean energy sectors. All of these things have massive implications for the countries where all of you who are joining us here today are working. And at the core of the conversation that we're going to have today is governance, right? We know that for decades, one of the key themes of the movement to promote better natural resource governance has been the sector has tended to disappoint citizens who have been counting on it to fuel broad-based, long-term sustainable development. In spite of the best efforts of many of us from government, civil society, and others who are on the call today. And today, as Leopold says, there are new challenges and new adaptations that are necessary, but the same inherent governance challenges that have always been an issue in the sector will continue to make it hard for these countries to adapt. Entrenched interests, information asymmetries, and a lack of resources by government and civil society to build capacity to oversee the sector in transition. A tendency for governments to plan on the best case scenario rather than a range of potential scenarios. Corruption and a lack of accountability. And so I'm really honored to be here with a fantastic group of panelists. What we're going to do is to talk about things from two angles. So our panelists are all, and actually panelists, I'd invite you to turn on your cameras now if you can. Our panelists are all experts in the field. They have deep knowledge across a range of topics. And so they're going to speak and share some of their reflections on the field and on the global marketplace. But I've also asked the panelists to reflect upon what the energy transition means for their work and the goals and modalities with which their organizations are working, because I know that all of you who are attending today are working in this field and not just thinking about it in an abstract sense, but thinking about what it means for the goals that you are trying to achieve in your work. So I'm going to introduce all of the panelists now, and then we'll get into the conversation. First, and all of them, I think their bios have been shared with you. All three of our panelists have fantastic, amazing experiences. I'm not going to go through their entire bios for you, but just to give you a little bit of a sense of who's who. First, we'll start with my colleague, Nafi Chinnery, who's the West Africa Regional Manager at NRGI, where she's in charge of our activities in Ghana, Nigeria, Sierra Leone, and elsewhere in Anglophone West Africa. Nafi is a social development expert with more than 20 years experience in development, including with Oxfam UK and the African Women's Development Fund. Then from there, we'll go to Maria Ramos, who's the Associate Director at Oxfam, where she co-leads the agency's Extractive Industries Global Program. Maria provides strategic leadership on oil, gas, and mining advocacy to promote greater transparency and accountability, with a particular focus on Southern, West, and East Africa. And she comes with experience with the Open Society Initiative of Southern Africa, the Rainforest Action Network, and other institutions. And then finally, we'll turn to James Nicholson, who's the head of corporate responsibility at Trafigura, where he's worked since 2010 and where he helped build the corporate affairs team. And of particular relevance for today's conversation, James is responsible for driving Trafigura's responsibility and stakeholder engagement agenda worldwide, including on transparency and the pursuit of responsible sourcing and supply of minerals and metals. James is joining us today from the Democratic Republic of Congo, where Trafigura is very active and will share, I'm sure, a lot of reflections on the ongoing work that the company is doing there. So how we've divided the session is we're going to start by talking about the oil and gas sector and how the approach to governance and policy need to evolve in that sector in light of climate change and the global energy transition. And then we'll do a sort of second round that will focus on the minerals and metals sector. I'm going to kick it off for each panelist with a question to kind of get the conversation going. To those of you who are participants, I would say that use the Q&A function. You don't have to wait until everything is over to ask questions. And I'm going to do my best as the conversation evolves to try and draw some of your questions to the fore. So Nafi, let's start with you. And I want to get your thoughts on how African oil producing countries can respond and evolve to this new dynamic. African oil producing countries face a significant set of challenges as they plan for the future. They're not the principal causes of climate change, but they're feeling its effects, both in terms of environmental damage and the impact that it's having on the market upon which many of their economies depend. So the question that we had for you is, what do you think African governments can do to adapt their governance and economic models to these global changes while still doing their best to accelerate national development? Nafi, over to you to jump in. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Patrick. I would like to add that the impact of the energy transition will not only result in the value and viability of African oil projects, but also in every sector of the continent's economy. And so in Africa, the energy transition cannot simply be about decarbonization. Importantly, it must be linked to the need to bridge the energy assets gap and encourage productive use of energy to create new competitive industrial clusters. And this requires a more comprehensive approach to dealing with the transition from government. African governments need to figure out how to transition and at what rate in order to avoid disrupting their economies. This raises two important questions for African governments. One is what will be the long-term implication of energy transition, and how can the region leverage clean industrialization to mitigate some of these transition risks. For example, IEA estimates that to meet the 2050 net zero targets, annual energy investment will need to increase between $4 and $5 trillion by 2030 from the current $2 trillion. To put all of that into perspective, this potential $5 trillion sum would amount to almost 3 times of the combined 1.69 trillion GDP of sub-Saharan African countries as of end of 2020. Investment of this could spur a major economic boom, and if utilized wisely and as part of a broader industrial strategy, can deliver sustainable long-term development opportunities. You know, any significant decline in the oil markets, for example, due to an accelerated energy transition, could plunge Africa into crisis. Energy transition, as you rightly noted, and all the previous speaker noted, it's a substantial risk for Africa and the benefits, but our actions by our government could make it worse. And so I want to talk about an example that happened in Ghana in July this year, where the Ghana National Oil Company, GNPC, and the Ministry of Energy made a proposal to the country's parliament to borrow up to $1.65 billion to buy back stakes into oil fields owned by Aker Energy and AGM as a way of dealing with the impact of energy transition. And this was strongly kicked against by Alliance of Civil Society Organizations in Ghana, and based on the values placed on the assets and the riskiness of the investments. Ghana needs to have clear pathway for supporting the national oil company, rather than using billions of US dollars of public money in risky bets that might instead go to support Ghana's health, education, and economic development. Energy transition requires an appropriate policy response, which Ghana may be running late on, but cannot be a guise for poor decisions that threaten the country's economic and physical outlook. African countries need to avoid that. You know, this is a bad example that I think that African countries need to avoid. And so I think that to ensure that, you know, they have a model that responds to the changing trend, African government need to manage the drop in oil demand, a plan that speaks to a specific country context, realities, and needs. And this will require a comprehensive outlook on what energy transition means, the risks and opportunities, and could also help in dealing with some of the apathy towards energy transition. We in Ghana had a bad experience trying to raise a lot of questions around the transaction between Aker Energy and the GNPC. And so the governments, the African governments also need to, you know, move away from the business as usual approach to extractive policy and governance that increases their exposure to resource scarce. Government need to prepare for a future with weaker demands for fossil fuel. And that all can happen if we have a comprehensive plan. African country and government need to put in place an appropriate plan on how to spend climate financing. You know, if you don't have an appropriate plan, and the plan should have strong and rigorous governance systems to guide implementation of programs. Otherwise, all the money will go down the drain, and we need to avoid that. And it's also important to have open and frank engagement with all stakeholders to ensure consensus on the viable path to the transition. A shared understanding among institutions on the risks and opportunities that come with energy transition would be helpful and could avoid some of the, you know, example that I used from Ghana. You know, a clearly defined and costed green industrial policy strategy with a roadmap and a well-defined metrics for benchmarking progress would be helpful. These industrial strategies will need to be reinforced by complementary policies that speak to each other. We tend to have disjointed policies or plan. We need to ensure that there is coordination and these policies speak to each other. Investment is key, and no one country on the continent has the required financial resources to deal with the transition. So African governments will need to accelerate regional integration, collaboration to create synergy among African countries and harmonization of policies and the fiscal regime across the continent. We think that after the Africa Continental Free Trade presents a unique opportunity for intracontinental trade on technologies that can support energy transition and boost growth. I think I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nafi, and you covered so much ground, and as appropriate for the vast need for coordination, breadth and depth, and looking at things in an integrated way across countries and across sectors. So thanks so much for kicking us off. Maria, I want to come to you next. Oxfam's work has always been focused very heavily on reducing poverty and reducing the risks that citizens and communities, especially those who are most impacted by the oil and gas sector, face associated with the industry. How is your approach to engagement on these governance questions in the sector changing in light of the changing needs of your partners and the global marketplace?
Thanks, Patrick, and thanks to NRGI and ETH for the invitation. So we're having this conversation on the heels of COP26. You mentioned subsidies, and for the first time we have an agreement that also mentions coal phase down, not a phase out, disappointingly. But to your question, I suppose our approach in some ways have changed, and in other ways it hasn't. The lessons and approaches from the resource curse hold, and as you say, they're the same inherent governance challenges that will likely continue, and I think you named these quite well. We have scaled up our focus and resources on climate. We have a bigger climate team and more attention and increased work on climate. But we continue to hold a rights-based approach to extraction with communities at the center of decision-making, the right to decide, to give or to withhold consent. And we continue to advocate for good governance of the sector. So effective accountability mechanisms, sanctions for companies that commit human rights and environmental harm, disclosure of company payments, contracts, all the work that we do, beneficial ownership, tax reporting, climate disclosures, including on assets and scope, 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So not just the emissions of your project, but what you put out in the world. But as we know, and as Leopold rightly shared, if we are to have half a chance of keeping global temperatures to 1.5, a majority of current fossil fuel reserves must be stranded. And for us, this phase out, this transition must be guided by the principles of equity, meaning the high income countries that have generated the vast majority of emissions, that have accumulated the vast majority of rents from the burning and the sale of fossil fuels, must act first and fastest. The US, of course, is a major, you and I are both sitting in the US, major culprit, high emissions and production. And to this end, we have ramped up work in the US, joining many others in calling for an end to fossil fuel subsidies, government subsidies, which encourage more extraction than would otherwise be economically viable and help lock in greenhouse gas emissions. And we're calling for the US Congress to end this multi-billion-dollar giveaway. And we're also calling for rich countries to scale up and follow through on climate finance commitments. So funds, and you mentioned this as well, funds needed for climate adaptation, mitigation. Governments failed to meet the $100 billion promise of climate finance by 2020. And from the funds that have been raised, a majority have been in the form of loans, not grants. And of course, this is hugely problematic. There are new commitments coming out of COP26. Not what the most vulnerable countries asked for, but it's there, and we'll need to ensure that these are met. And then we're also doing some work in low and income and middle income countries where there's a risk that assets will be stranded, where there's over-reliance on fossil fuel revenues. Over-reliance on fossil fuel revenues is a risk. For example, East Timor where we're focused on diversification. And actually, this thinking through on your new cooperation with ETH, I would put this on the high end agenda as well. Diversification. I think that's a nut that we haven't collectively cracked. But East Timor, of course, hugely reliant on oil revenues. We're calling with young people calling for revenues to be invested in other productive sectors of the economy, particularly agriculture. 2/3 of the population of East Timor are farmers. In South Africa, so the government has committed to transitioning from coal, and coming out of COP26, there is a commitment from rich countries to support in this transition. So we'll be starting work with coal mining communities to ensure that they're engaged and actively participating in plans around the phase out to just considerations of income, livelihoods, public health, ensuring that these are taken into account. And then maybe the last thing is that we can't talk about or work on the energy transition without calling out political capture, naming the fossil fuel industry and its lobby that have been blocking progress on climate for decades. They were 500 strong in Glasgow, as we know. The delegation was bigger than that of any one country. The oil majors have been funding climate denialism for 4+ decades. Exxon knew, Total knew. And the industry has a massive stronghold on policy. Here in the US, there's reason why we haven't had a strong rule on company payment disclosures. And we can certainly expect that they'll continue to be the obstacle on this issue in the future.
Thanks so much, Maria, and very interesting to hear how Oxfam's work is evolving to respond to these challenges. I'm sure there'll be questions and reactions, in the Q&A as we move forward. James, I want to turn it over to you to hear a little bit about the perspective from the industry. Trafigura is one of the world's largest traders of oil and petroleum products, and I know you, like others, are facing a lot of uncertainties about the oil and gas industry and where it's going to go in the future. So as these uncertainties grow, interested in hearing about how the company's approach to planning in the sector is changing. And in particular, of interest to, I think, many of the participants that are with us here today, interested in hearing whether you anticipate any changes to the relationships or governance arrangements that you have as a company with state-owned enterprises and governments in producer countries. So James, over to you.
Thanks so much, and many thanks for the opportunity to speak to you now. It's actually been some time since I last spoke to ETHZ, and it's great to be back. The last time I spoke, I was speaking about transparency and Trafigura's commitment to disclosing payments to governments. I'll reflect in a moment on how that conversation has changed. Now, I think perhaps it's worth just if I may, for the audience, just quickly to explain what it is a trading company does, because often that's misunderstood. Trafigura's business is a very physical one. So we physically source commodities, often from remote locations. We store and we blend and we improve those commodities, and then we deliver into the world's fabricators, for example, whether it's vehicle manufacturers, major industrial construction companies, etc., etc. So we play a really important role in the global movement of goods. We've seen huge disruption over recent years in the movement of goods, and supply chains have been absolutely turned on their head. We've also seen sort of volatility, not volatility, but big changes in our own business, because we're a service provider. We have a relatively limited physical footprint. We do own mines. We do own access to ports and transport systems, vessels. We have 30 vessels on the water, for example. But principally, we're a service provider. And I actually, over lunch, just chatting here, I was trying to explain what it was that we as commodity traders do. And you could look at us almost like the FedEx of the commodities world. So getting commodities to market. We are fundamentally changing our business model. And in the 2 years since I last spoke to ETHZ, we've developed a new arm to our business. As you rightly point out, we're one of the largest traders of oil and petroleum products, equally with metals and minerals. And as of 2 years ago, we started trading power and renewables, renewable energy. And that third arm is the third arm and of the business and will likely form a substantial part of our revenue in future. Now, on revenue, we're one of the larger companies in the world. So we have revenues of over $180 billion a year. We make substantial payments to governments. Those payments for commodities amount to in the region of $35+ billion per year. Now, when I last spoke to ETH, we were discussing why it was that Trafigura had started to disclose those payments in increasing levels of granularity, and with NRGI's support, we've been on, frankly, forgive the cliche, but a journey of enhanced disclosure. Why? Well, rightfully, the citizens of producer nations are like never before able to hold their governments to account. And we've had to learn fast. We've had to explain our business. We've had to make these disclosures, and often having difficult conversations. How is it that Trafigura trades coal, and what is the future for that substance? Now, you know, it would be on the one hand, if considering my kids, it would be preferable if only we could just stop trading these materials. The world could stop demanding coal, it could stop demanding oil and petroleum products. But we know it's not that simple, and I'm not making excuses, but I do want to just briefly highlight a reality, and that is, for example, in respect of oil and gas, there are almost 800 million people worldwide who don't have access to electricity today, right? Now, 2.6 billion people don't have access to clean cooking. And what does that mean? That means that they are wandering increasing distance to secure firewood to burn. Who is it that does that? Typically, it's the women, and as a result, are deprived of education. The firewood is burnt, maybe it's combusted without oxygen, carbon monoxide, poisoning results, etc. The number of deaths from this situation is innumerable. It's absolutely massive. So we have to, when looking at the transition and just reflecting for a moment on what Nafi was saying, how to transition is just so very complex. And as a service provider, Trafigura, we provide these commodities, clean, less clean, and we need to provide a service that is well informed and responsive to this agenda. But it is going to be gradual, and with clean cooking, transitioning away from wood, biomass stoves is absolutely logical. But the transition fuel is going to be LPG. And LPG, because of the energy density of LPG, it's such that you can continue to cook, whereas solar doesn't provide that energy that's required. So yeah, this is a very knotty and challenging conversation. Trafigura is a service provider, for sure, but we do also have a real role in influencing and working with governments to better effect, particularly on transparency, because unless more governments, for example, sign up to the EITI, making active disclosures of payments made by companies like Trafigura, they're going to be less trusted, and they're not going to be able to respond to their citizens' needs, and that's not going to end well.
Thanks so much, James. And yeah, very valuable overview. Maybe one quick follow-up question, because I know it will be of interest to those on the call, is you mentioned that the company's business is evolving and moving in more into the clean energy. We'll talk a little bit about the mining side and cobalt in particular coming up. Do you have any reflections that you could share for participants who are from oil and gas producing countries on, relatively speaking, how can they be thinking about the size of the industry over the next 10 or 20 years? I think a lot of the people who are part of this course and who are joining us today are trying to think about some of the questions that Leopold raised. What does decline look like in a practical sense? there's a lot of unpredictability, but anything that you can share about how you as a company are thinking about the relative size of these different arms of your business and how they might evolve over time, I think would be really interesting and relevant to those who are with us.
Yeah, I know. Thanks, Patrick. I wish I was an economist, and so I could give you some flashy figures. I can't do that. I can tell you that I can give you sort of more qualitative sort of data, if you like, and that's to say that the appetite of the business of Trafigura to facilitate this transition is considerable. But we have to go at a pace that is going to work for example, our government partners. And as I mentioned, we have significant partnerships with governments where we can supply, for example, the majority of refined products that a particular country might demand. I think what this comes back to, and I guess to Maria's point around taking a rights-based approach, we as a trader have leverage in the conversation. And therefore, for people like me, I'm going to be spending more and more time working with government partners to try and facilitate this change and ensure that, to coin the phrase from the Paris Agreement, that no one gets left behind, because that's what I'm seeing. So, and that's really where my day job is, frankly, is managing the human rights impacts of this transition and in making sure that indeed it does work for the citizens of producer countries. And yeah, it's not straightforward, and we'll come on to that, of course, in the discussion over metals.
Great, thanks so much, James. We're going to come to metals momentarily, but we already have some great questions that are percolating in the Q&A, and so I actually want to steer a couple of them to you guys. One is actually a combination question. So as we were planning for this session, we encouraged panelists to ask one another questions, and Maria has a question posed to you, Nafi. You mentioned government apathy to engage on the energy transition. How do you think they could be further incentivized, and what's the role for civil society in pushing for this? And I actually want to join that for you, Nafi, with a question that we got in the Q&A from Saurai Kambunda, apologies if I'm mispronouncing your name, saying that looking at the transition risks, loss of employment, government revenues, profits, pushback will be expected. What are the opportunities, spaces, networks available to push for this change? Nafi, do you have any reactions to those questions? It's about setting the agenda and what it means for us collectively in doing so.
Yeah, thanks very much. Yeah, and you recall I referred to an instance that civil society tried to, raise a number of questions around government transactions with AK Energy to increase the stake, and so. And what we experienced during those moments of engagement with government tells us that there is a lot of, we would experience pushback from government on this because, again, of the nature of the economies in Africa. A lot of these countries depend on oil revenue, and there's a lot of misconception around energy transition that is a Western agenda. And so we need, first of all, to make sure that we have reliable information and data that can back any arguments that we make. So civil society organizations need to be well informed, need to do a lot of research and have the accurate data to back any argument or advocacy that we make. And because you'll be speaking about the economy and how the economy will be affected. You'll be talking about decisions around making risky decisions, and to be able to rebut any decision that government makes, you need to make sure that we have accurate data to inform any arguments or advocacy that we make. And so that's the first position. I think what makes us civil society organization to progress and to make some, small wins in the advocacy that I referred to was because we were very, we had accurate, reliable data. We were very informed. We had done our research and we were able to present them in very convincing manner. and you have to be able to, gauge the mood of government and the people, because really government is talking about meeting everyday needs of people, about employment, about health, about education, and how do you balance that? And so you need to have data that speaks to the fact that the decision that government is making is actually going to affect the ability to provide those services to ordinary people. So it's quite tough. It's a process. It's a process that we need to continuously engage in. We need to build, alliances and forces, movements that can present reliable, accurate information to get government to prepare. So I think that that will be my first reaction to those questions.
Thanks very much, Nafi. Maria, I want to turn to you with I'm going to combine a couple of questions that we got in the Q&A. One is from Regina Navuga, reacting to your note about political capture and saying it's the same in most countries. That's what we see a lot. What are some of the strategies we can use to minimize this challenge? And then I'd like to actually combine that with the question from Danilo Borja, who asks you, how are villages affected by the oil industry being impacted by the energy transition, and how are they thinking? How do they live after oil companies will look like and evolve? Big questions, but linked, I think. The questions of political capture, both at a national level, but also what it means for people who are living in places that are most directly affected.
Yeah, I think Nafi's absolutely right. I mean, it's information, and then with information, it's acting on it. So calling out the true cost of extraction. In Peru, for example, we're working with a number of organizations on ensuring that mining, well, one, that the government recognizes the public health impacts and the vast public health impacts of extraction, and then ring fences extractive revenues to address those, both to mitigate and also to address those. And I think that's where we need to go, is understanding the true impacts of extraction on environment and public health, and then ensuring that those are calculated and those are disclosed and taken into account in terms of use of revenues. Interrogation also of expected revenues. I mean, often there's just these blown up expectations about what the scope and the timing of revenues, and which creates huge expectations with local communities, and conflict as well when those expectations aren't met. Expectations are about jobs, expectations about revenues, and then calling out corruption, calling out people by name. This brings, of course, incredible risk, and the risks to human rights defenders, to transparency activists is huge, and we're seeing a crackdown of this, pre-post COVID, a crackdown of this, and the space in which activists can engage safely. But it was also very inspiring to see young people at the COP. So activists from Kenya, from Uganda, really calling this out and being vocal and visible.
Thanks very much, Maria. So we're going to shift gears now and talk a little bit more directly about the minerals and metals side of this. And James, I'm actually wondering if I could come to you first on this. Trafigura is a major trader of cobalt and is continuing to build stronger ties with the government and state-owned enterprises, including in the Democratic Republic of Congo, from where you're joining us today. I think all of the participants would be interested in learning more about what steps the company is taking to promote good governance of its cobalt trading activities, and what do you see as the biggest outstanding challenges in the sector related to governance?
Thanks, Patrick. Very few people knew about cobalt before 2016. It was a product, it was a byproduct. It was of no particular interest. Perhaps people were aware of the cobalt color, but they didn't know where it came from. They certainly didn't know how it was produced. And that all changed when Amnesty International released a report on the horrific impacts of artisanal cobalt mining, specifically in the DRC, and the large numbers of children that were involved. And that was a wake-up call for any company that traded cobalt. Now, at the time, Drakagura was embarking on in commercial discussions with a significant cobalt producer in the DRC, a mechanized miner called Chemaf. And I was fortunate to be part of those conversations because our traders had the foresight to realize that indeed that the social costs around artisanal mining that was occurring in the vicinity of the concession, not within the mechanized mine, but outside, was incredibly dangerous. It's a volatile community. For any of you who are familiar with artisanal mining, it's a community that has nothing and has nothing to lose. Any major industrial miner needs to engage with artisanal miners. Now, artisanal mining as a whole is not new. It actually furnishes the world with about 20% of its metals and minerals. That's a huge number. 90% of the world's miners are artisanal miners, right? So we're talking about a huge population performing an incredibly powerful and important role. But these people are marginalized. They're shunned by major mechanized miners. And there's a huge need to change that conversation. And that's really where my role has come in, because I was able to engage with this particular partner ahead of time and work out a way in which we could formalize artisanal cobalt mining. And that involves basically making it safe. And there's a lot available on our website about this and how we might do that. But a simple measure is simply stopping individuals digging deep pits and tunnels. And those pits and tunnels can extend 70 meters underground. They collapse at a moment's notice, and the impact is disastrous. Now, why am I giving this background? Well, we know that demand for cobalt is growing hugely. Now, why is that? Well, the majority of the world's electric vehicles use a battery chemistry composition that requires nickel, cobalt, and manganese. And cobalt's role is basically essential from a safety perspective because it provides the structural integrity of the cell. Now, cobalt demand worldwide is going to more than double by 2025 against today's levels. Another point of use is in batteries or portable electronics, sorry. So they use a slightly different chemistry, which is lithium cobalt oxide, and the batteries are smaller, but sales volumes are much, much higher, and the cobalt content is proportionally higher per unit. Now, again, the demand outlook for this is not like electric vehicles, but again, we're seeing sort of 5% year-on-year growth. Now, what I'm trying to say is it actually can be brought back to the earlier comments by Leopold, and that's that mining operations can often take up to 10 years to develop. The world's demand for cobalt cannot wait 10 years. It's that we've done the maths, and there's an interesting white paper actually available on our website on this very topic. The world needs artisanal cobalt. Now, that's a really uncomfortable need for most of us, frankly. So we have to find a way to extract and get this product to market in a safe manner. No deaths, no suffering, fair prices being paid at point of source. We're talking about 200,000 artisanal diggers in the Congo, probably with 6 or 7 dependents each. So if we can actually turn this around, the potential, the developmental impact is massive. Now, as a trader, I get it. why would anyone trust Trafigura, right, to do this or to get engaged? Well, this is deeply personal for me personally. I helped originate this project with Chemaf. That was only for 5,000 workers. We proved that for every 1,000 workers, $1 million was pumped into the local economy every year. That's not my findings. That's economists from the IMF that discovered that. And again, the paper is available on our website. But what I'm looking at is the big goal. It's 200,000 workers. And Trafigura is a buyer from the state through this new entity that's been set up called EGC. And therefore, we have significant leverage to make sure that they are working to standards. The standards, again, now are publicly available. Our contract with the government is publicly available. There are many different ways in which we as Trafigura can help influence and work with our government partners, and also to basically to shine a light from the outside, say this is what matters to the world now. As we hold our mobile phones or whatever in our hands, people need to know we're in a new era of traceability and transparency. And yes, I could talk to you about technical solutions, blockchain, etc. But fundamentally, the reason why I'm here in Kolwezi, which is the center of the world's cobalt industry, is that I'm working with government to engage with civil society right now on what it is that EGC is doing, how it's going to do it. And this is really tough. Citizens they want to know what role their country will play, what role they can play. And it's not easy. So, for the first time, I'm traveling again post-COVID. I'm gonna have a lot more trips down here as the project hopefully picks up pace. But the potential is absolutely massive in terms of the positive socio-economic developmental impact.
Thanks very much, James, for that overview. And yeah, big questions ahead. If you can put the link, and actually I would invite all of the panelists to put the links to relevant documents as we're talking into the chat so participants can see them. In particular, I actually got a question from a Congolese partner who saw that you were going to be speaking today and said, is the contract available? Where is it? And so if there are links to where those documents exist, I think they would be valuable for people to see. Maria, I want to come to you now, and you can broaden us out a little bit, I think. So, when it comes to these minerals that are necessary for clean energy technologies, cobalt and others, you hear a mix of conversations from different people in our field. Some are really focused on the kinds of opportunities that the boom in demand for these materials may bring, and the need, as James says, to really accelerate production to serve clean energy. Others really focus on the risks that a boom that is not well governed or not well managed can really inflict or impose harms, especially on vulnerable communities, but also in terms of corruption more broadly. How are you thinking about this? As you think about the balance and how to engage on these questions, what sorts of approaches are you and your partners taking on the mining sector as it evolves?
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. Yeah, we focus on the latter part of your questions. So yes, so 100% renewable energy future. This will require massive amounts of metals, manufacturing of PV panels, wind turbines, and then, as James said, batteries for electric vehicles, which is likely where the biggest demand will be. I think for me, three questions stand out. One is how much, where, and by whom. So how much, I think we really need to interrogate demand. There are a number of groups that are doing this. There are predictions that demand of certain metals, nickel, lithium, copper, cobalt, will double, triple, quadruple from current figures, but the transition to renewables really has to be accompanied by a transformation away from irresponsible mining. And this means prioritizing low impact circular economy solutions that really reduce demand through recycling, reuse, reduction. Technology is changing and will continue to change. There are many battery manufacturers that want to kick their cobalt habit off because of the links to child labor, to unethical mining practices. Elon Musk has wanted a cobalt-free battery for Tesla for years, and I think earlier this year in Texas, at the university in Texas, there was a breakthrough in production of a cobalt-free battery. So if you're in government, the forecasts of increased demand and also following the post-COVID stimulus plans will lead you to have these high expectations. But as we know from our work, and certainly from the work of NRGI, forecasts are notoriously bullish. And again, technology leading to better mineral performance will change. There will likely be substitutions of metals because of high mineral prices or scarcity in the supply, and because of recycling and reuse. So investments in transition minerals could become obsolete or stranded, and governments need to plan carefully for this, to model different scenarios for future demand and prices, and of course to ensure that, like fossils, that mining projects provide an anchor for diversification. The where question, so the search for metals will go further, deeper into frontier locations in geographies with limited social and material infrastructure, on the lands of farmers, of indigenous peoples, of historically marginalized communities, creating these geographies of conflict over concerns and competition for water, for land. And this will inevitably lead to increased threats to intimidation, assassination of water, environmental, and human rights defenders. And we're seeing this, and we're calling this out. And also for women human rights defenders who face particular risks and challenges in their activism because of their gender. And the metal frontier is also going to the deep sea. So the impacts of deep sea mining are similar to those of fish trawl nets that are dragged across the seafloor, basically dragging everything with them to get these polymetallic nodules. And prospecting in the Pacific and PNG is raising huge concerns over the impacts to marine wildlife and the livelihoods of Pacific Islanders who depend on the ocean for survival. And then finally, the by whom. So a number of the licenses for transition mineral projects are held by junior companies, juniors that do the exploration and prospecting. And they're small companies, maybe one or two projects with limited experience with and without robust international rights standards and community consultation and consent and environmental protection. They're the first on the ground, engaging communities, and compared to the majors, they're the least equipped. From an influencing standpoint, from where I stand, it's a challenge to us because they have little reputational risks. They're not a known name. They operate in the dark, and similarly to traders. James is on the call, that there is increased expectation for commodity traders that have historically operated in the dark to disclose public interest information, to adopt and implement ESG due diligence systems across their supply chains.
Thanks so much.
Leave it there.
Yeah, thanks so much, Maria. Sorry, I had an unmuting error. Much appreciated. I'm going to turn it. I'm going to come back to you, to Nafi, to kind of bring some of these pieces together. But before I do so, I just want to say to those of you who are attending the session, we have just under 15 minutes left, and we will end on time. So we have a couple of questions in the queue for the Q&A, but I would encourage others who have questions not to wait because we don't want to run out of time to get your questions in. So even as Nafi is sharing these reflections, if people have other questions, please jump in. Nafi, I want to come back to you to help us kind of bring some of these pieces together a little bit, and in particular, to think about what the role, we've talked a lot about government responsibility and company responsibility for accountability in these evolving spaces. But I'd like to ask you if you can help kind of bring some of the pieces together when we think about what the international community can do and what those of us who are in civil society and the research community can do. So, essentially, what are the steps that donors, international governance initiatives, civil society actors, and researchers can do to really prioritize fair and equitable transition in resource-rich countries, especially low-income resource-rich countries? How do we carry this forward in our collective work as we go ahead?
Thank you very much, Patrick. And I think all of these actors must first open up and appreciate the peculiar characteristics of the economic structure, the structures of producer countries, and what challenges African economies will likely face in the transition process. And I think that's ensuring that we have, first of all, a just pathway to the transition. It's very important. Make clear financial support for the transition, and that's particularly to international community. Adequate financial and technical support to countries to develop comprehensive transition plans with clear timelines and targets that speak to the different countries' context is really important. And we've all heard about the promises and the pledges to finance the transition. So climate financing package from international community here, and should not, as I always say, should given as loans to developing countries. And I think that is quite radical when these countries have had very less contribution to climate change. This is not fair and not just to developing countries, and does not inspire integrity in the climate change and cleaner energy advocacy. A just transition is required. I also think that as a priority, if international governance initiatives, and I think that you refer to the issue, talking about issues of governance within the energy transition as your prelude to this whole conversation, that I think it's international governance initiatives must make compliance to good governance and accountability instruments, key requirements in any financial support towards the transition. And the need to push for better integration of disclosures, and I was happy to hear about Drakagura and the disclosures that they are making. We need to have better integration of disclosures and dialogues around climate-related financial risk into EITI and other extractive transparency initiatives, with a particular focus on transparency of the national oil companies' expenditures. This is really, really important. I also think that a rethink is required of international norms around industry practice, such as investment behaviors again by the national oil companies and the structure of oil and gas contracts, right? All of these need to have, we need to look at those. Need to avoid the occurrence that we had in Ghana with, the planned transaction between ECA Energy and GNPC, when all the processes were not disclosed, they were not transparent, there were not engagement. It was the decision to raise that money was not based on any assessment, risk or opportunities. We need to avoid all of that. And so everything is required of international norms around industry practices, And I also think that from everything that I've heard, I think the CSOs need to invest in knowledge, building their own knowledge. We need to invest in movement and alliances building. We need to invest in research and building credible information and data that can back any advocacy that we engage in for transparency around climate-related financial risk. This is really, really key, because you need to understand the state of the economy. You need to understand what all the risk factors and opportunities are, and be able, before you engage in advocacy. So building knowledge and skills of civil society actors, it's very, very key. International governance institutions, donors, and all non-state actors should redirect. And I think, again, this is another bold proposal that I'm making here. It's redirect and step up advocacy focus on Western producer countries to stop fossil fuel production. And this is again around the issue of equity that I talked about, and how energy transition is seen as a Western agenda. We need to, there has to be an increase in engaging Western producers to stop, to live up to their commitments. Until these countries change their own practices on fossil fuel production, they will not have any integrity asking producer countries or African countries in the global south to stop. The double standards in approach I think, make it really difficult for stakeholders like civil society actors like us to engage in productive and progressive dialogue on energy transition. So, yeah, thank you.
Thanks very much, Nafi. Really connects a lot of important things together. So I'm going to share a few of the questions that came. And what I'm going to do, James, I'm going to come to you first with two questions that have come specifically directed to you. But what I'd ask, James, is that if you have, we have 8 minutes left, so I'm going to give you two tough questions for a rapid response. And then I'd ask at the same time if you have any final thoughts to use this as a moment to do that. And then Maria and Nafi, I'll come to you guys as well. So James, two questions for you. One from Trang Huang, again, apologies if I'm getting your name wrong. I'd love to hear more from you about the financial contribution of business and enterprise in climate finance. And then one from Maria Fisher. Interesting to hear that the approach of engaging with ASM, in quotes, not only is important for local development, but also a necessity because of a global demand in the case of cobalt. Formalization of ASM is progressing only slowly in many resource-rich countries. What, in your opinion, are the challenges that hinder better formalized and thus fairer, more responsible production in critical strategic minerals? And what can make downstream companies engage more and take on responsible sourcing strategies? So big questions. If you can give, a sort of 2-minute response, but let's keep the channels open after the session as well.
I've got it. Thank you, Patrick. So firstly, on financial contribution of business to climate finance, Trafigura is privately held, so we rely on about $60 billion of finance every year from about 140 different banks. The appetite of those banks to invest in, for example, renewable energy, we know is just growing at an incredible rate, and in part that's why we've helped set up our power and renewables training and trading division. The appetite to move away from fossil fuels is, at times worrying. As I've mentioned, the transition is not going to be as straightforward as some might like. In respect to formalization, what stops this, artisanal formalization? This is immensely complicated. I've said before, this is a community that is marginalized. It is often violent, and the relationship with large-scale miners is typically very poor. They operate in the fringes of concessions. And so that in itself represents a constant conflict the individuals face. In terms of downstream companies engaging more, I would love everyone on this call to help me in this. It is unacceptable for companies, and one has been named already, to say that they're moving away from cobalt because they don't like to deal in the DRC. You know what? That's not good enough. The DRC has an incredible opportunity to capitalize on this immense natural resource. Perhaps only 8 years until cobalt is engineered out of batteries, and big companies can and must play a role in helping create demand for safe, responsible cobalt, because if we get it right, the developmental impact is going to be phenomenal.
Thanks, James, for the depth and succinctness of your answer. Maria, I'm going to come back to you again to respond to a couple of questions, with anything that inspires you, but also any closing thoughts that you might have. One question that came to you specifically is, Latin America is one of the most dangerous places for environmental defenders. Mafias and power groups work hand to hand, and the state provides business facilities in the name of development, state capture, race to the bottom. What do you think civil society organizations can do to help reverse or visibilize the situation? And again, big question, and you have 1 minute to respond with any thoughts.
Yeah, no, it's scary. It's scary. I mean, what's happening, for example, right now in Guatemala, across Central America, we had one of our offices closed in Nicaragua because of this. They're huge issues. I think we can't do this alone. Calling increased attention to this, naming people by names, sanctions on the table, engaging other governments, and providing the needed protection for individuals and communities, and collectivizing this.
Thanks very much, Maria. Nafi, I'm going to give you the final word in response to any of the questions. In particular, there's one question that actually has been in the queue for quite a while from Sarai Kambunda, which is essentially about what global leaders are doing, right? There's a potential power shift based in mineral-based countries or the countries that are mechanized to develop renewable energy technology. Are we actually seeing a power shift already visible from COP26? Do these pledges made by global leaders matter, and how can poor countries either respond or start driving the train more than has been the case in the past? And again, any other closing thoughts that you might have as well?
That's quite a tricky one, but I think that I kind of mentioned it at the beginning that in all of these processes, the African governments need to have their own agenda. What's the agenda of African countries to engage meaningfully in these processes? You need to have, because it's coming, and if you do not want Western government to set the agenda for you, you need to set your agenda, and you need to have a plan that speaks to your context, the realities and need. So requiring some kind of comprehensive outlook on what the transition looks like and factoring in all the risks and opportunities. So have a plan around how you're going to deal with the drop in oil revenue and and how are you going to engage in this entire process. It's very, very important to have. I think also that, and I think I mentioned it, but I'd like to reiterate that point again at a priority, because we know that this whole process is going to open up opportunities for risk and opportunities for government. But how do we position ourselves to ensure that the right thing is done and that countries benefit from it and the people in the country actually benefit from it? And I want to reiterate a point that I raised earlier on about the need to make sure that good governance and accountability instruments are key requirements in any financial support towards the transition, and the need to push for better integration of disclosures and dialogue around climate-related risk into EIT and other extractive transparency initiatives. Very, very important. With that, I think that civil society actors need to be very involved. There's no way you are going to be asked, from our experience, there's no way civil society actors are going to be asked to come to the table. You have to find your way to the table to ensure that the processes are transparent, and then you're able to hold your governments accountable. And how you do that is you be informed, make sure that you do your homework. We have the relevant data to back any move that we make.
Fantastic. Thank you, Nafi. And wherever all of you are around the world, in your own way, please join me in thanking our three panelists, as well as Leopold, Fritz, Margarita, Felicitas, and everybody for the fantastic organization and substantive contributions to today's session. Three words that I want to leave you all with to kind of connect a lot of the big themes that our panelists discussed. One is transparency. And as Nafi just said, what transparency and accountability mean in terms of getting a real dialogue going in this space and on these issues needs to change and evolve. Second, integration. What all three panelists touched on in different ways, the need to de-silo planning around these sectors with planning around energy, planning around sustainable development, planning around what it means to protect and defend human rights. And the third is equity. And I think we all still have a lot to do in defining what equity will mean as the energy transition moves forward in terms of protecting people from the harmful effects of climate change, equity across countries, and equity within countries. I think this is a big challenge for us as a global movement to put some real teeth into what that means as our global situation evolves. So with that, I'd like to formally close the session with thanks to everybody who joined and presented today, but also thanks to all of you around the world who took time out from your schedules to join the session. Stay tuned for more from Oxfam, Trafigura, NRGI, ETH, and we really want to continue the dialogue and learn also from all of you around the world who are continuing to make progress on these questions. So thank you very much. Have a wonderful rest of your day wherever you are, and a wonderful weekend.